Hi, it's Laura at Aquarian18. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome or welcome back. I am here with a VR to a tag, and the tag is one deck for each sign. And the tag was started by Steph at Journal d'une femme moderne spirituelle Steph. And I will put a link to Steph's channel below to the video that started the tag. This is, I think, a tag that's been out there for at least a couple of months at this point. But both my moon and my Mars are in Taurus. I do not rush. Time is a social construct. I don't do well with urgent rushing. So here I am late doing the VR to the tag. I will do my best to explain why I've chosen each deck for each sign. Some of them might be a bit weird for associations, but I'm a beginner when it comes to astrology, so I have enjoyed this as a learning opportunity anyway. I did choose to just go with associations that I've been developing for each sign as opposed to the provided keywords. So some of them are a little bit kind of adjacent to the prompts that were provided, but that's okay. I think it's all in the spirit of the tag anyway. So without further ado, Aries deck. And folks may know what my Aries deck is if you know which deck I keep in this bag. For my Aries deck, I chose Thea's Tarot. Here's the back. And when I think of Aries, I think of the fact that Aries is the first sign, the cardinal fire sign, and Aries is, an initiator. And this is the oldest deck that I have in my collection. So it's an early deck. And I think of Aries being action-oriented, being independent, being enthusiastic, being assertive, being direct, being clear, being forward. And I think that this deck is those things. So, it may not have the fiery color palette that one might first think for a fire sign, but I do think that it has the very much kind of forward moving, forward thinking, strongly independent and action oriented personality to it. I love this card, if you can see. This is a person on a couch with a cat there at the end, which I like. This is also a deck that kind of breaks a lot of the rules, I think, which could be associated with Aries as kind of independent. It has some cards that are landscape, for example. It goes quite far from any kind of, traditional Smith-Waite imagery in ways that I love. So that is my Thea's Tarot. Next up is Taurus, and as I mentioned, Taurus is my moon sign. Taurus is also where my Mars is, so though it is not my sun sign, I do think of myself as having a lot of Taurus energy in my chart. And I think of Taurus, the fixed earth sign, as very grounding, very steady, very practical, I think. And it's in order right now, but I chose Naturescapes for this. Of course, as a landscape deck, this is a very earthy deck. It is also a deck that I find to be one of my most kind of flexible and multi-purpose and all-around kind of decks. So it's stable in that kind of, it's a go-to kind of a deck for me. And it's one that does certainly ground me. And it's a deck that I cherish as an all-time favorite, certainly. And thinking about Taurus as a sign that, revels in kind of sensuous and sense-based experiences, right? The senses. This deck, for me, speaks to that as well. So I think it's very evocative of all kinds of sensory experience in the way that it depicts landscapes. So that is my Taurus deck, Naturescapes. I did have quite a few that I thought could probably be, the really earthy Taurus deck, but this is the one that I went to first, so that's where I went. I have actually, I don't usually stick to the rules and the tags, but I have actually only picked one per sign, even when I have been tempted to pick another. So the next sign, of course, is Gemini, mutable air. I think of Gemini as kind of curious, as a sign that is very communicative, very chatty, perhaps a little bit restless at times. And so I was thinking about that for Gemini. And then I had watched Auntie K's VR, and Auntie K talked about Gemini aesthetic and loving kind of rainbow puke kind of aesthetic. And then Julie from Peekaboo Rose in the comments agreed with that Gemini definitely, there's a rainbow puke aesthetic association for Gemini. So then I was thinking, okay, a deck that for me speaks to this kind of curiosity and kind of chattiness of Gemini energy, but then also has a bit of a rainbow puke dimension to it, which, is not necessarily an aesthetic that I think is particularly well represented in my collection, if I'm honest. And where I ended up was The Way of the Panda Tarot by Kimberly Tsan. And this is a deck that is playful, has some extra cards here. I'll just put those to one side. It's a deck that certainly has this kind of, certainly rainbow colors. Pandas themselves are not so rainbow, but the deck itself is full of beautiful colors in this deck. Very bright. It's one of the most brightly colored decks I have, I think, in some ways. And it is certainly one that feels like it embodies the kind of playful curiosity, and is also a very clear reader. So it's a very much conversational kind of deck, I think. And this deck also has one of my favorite deck guidebooks, the Book of Pandas. And this deck is certainly never boring. So that is my Gemini deck, The Way of the Panda Tarot. Next up, I should have taken all these out of the boxes before I started. Oh well. Next up is Cancer. And Cancer, cardinal water sign. Cancer, I think of complexity. I think of certainly sensitivity and caring. And I also think of Cancer, and I think of that kind of self-protectiveness of the shell, with the squishy middle. And, that kind of protective caring. And so when I am feeling that way, and I'm feeling emotional, and I'm feeling sensitive, and I'm feeling like I need some gentle, nurturing, supportive kind of reading from a deck. And this one, again, may be one that people would be surprised that would be picked for this prompt. When I think of that and that kind of deck that I would go to in that kind of time, I think of the Many Queens Tarot. I feel very supported by this deck. It's a deck that I chose, actually, with self-care in mind, with working around self-love, particularly around kind of body-related self-love. And so this for me is a sensitive and caring deck that feels supportive and that holds me in a nice way. So that's the deck I chose for Cancer. Perhaps an unexpected pick, but there it is. Next up is Leo. And one of Steph's original keywords when she started this tag, one of the keywords for Leo that kind of stuck in my head when I was thinking about this was solar. And I think of definitely Leo, I think of sunshine and radiance and radiating a kind of confidence and boldness and, very expressive. I also think of Leo and the Leos that I know as very generous and giving. And the deck that I came up with as a Leo deck for me in my collection is Afro Tarot 2. And this is the back. Oh, the lighting's doing something weird. This deck is, in terms of the decks in my collection, one of the ones that I think, in terms of having this really gold, sparkly gilding, is a deck that feels really radiant to me. It has a lot of beautiful color in it as well. There are these beautiful open skies, and there's so much sun in this deck. It's a very expressive deck. And since I've had it, it's become very much a favorite as a kind of Smith-Waite inspired deck to read with. This is one of the best ones in my collection, in my opinion. And yeah, it feels very much like a confident, radiant, sunny kind of energy in terms of kind of personality, but also in terms of all the beautiful gold and the gold text and the gold items that people are holding in the deck. It's beautiful deck. So that's the one that stood out for me as a solar, radiant, sunshine, bright and bold Leo deck. The Afro Tarot 2 that I'm holding upside down. There we go. Next sign we have is Virgo. And when I think of Virgo, I think of approaching things in a very analytical way. I think of Virgo as very precise, on the kind of worst side, perhaps a kind of perfectionist tendencies, but on the positive side, a very exact, very meticulous, very critical. And critical is a good thing for me. I think it's important to always be critical. So this kind of very crisp and clear, it's a very analytic sign for me. And so what I thought of was, what deck do I kind of read in that way? That I would take a very analytical approach to reading. And for that, I chose the Orbifold Tarot by Michael Bridge Dixon. This is the mini size. There's a bigger size of this deck. And this deck is very abstract, but it is very kind of clean lines on the sparse black background. And it is a deck that is all about different elemental combinations represented in color. So you think of the way the magician has all of the tools, all of the elements, so it has all of the color there. Whereas the Fool being represented with the color of air, yellow. And so there's a real kind of system here of element and suit-based representation, while the imagery itself is this very kind of geometric circle kind of imagery. And so if I think of a deck that I would read in an analytic way, analyzing the combinations of elements that come up with a very precise kind of artwork style, then that would be this deck, which is why I thought of it for Virgo. Next up is Libra, and this is probably one of the less surprising picks. So Libra, I think of someone who is justice-oriented. If we're like someone, as a sun sign, everybody has every sign in their chart in one way or another. When I think of Libra, I think of justice-orientedness. I think of also balance. I think of like decision-making. And of course, it's an air sign, so it's very kind of thoughtful kind of decision-making with justice in mind. My partner is a Libra. And when I think of Libra, then I think of the Next World Tarot. I'm sure that I'm actually probably not the only person who made this pick for this sign. But certainly, if I think of a really social justice focused and visionary, new ideas and forward thinking kind of deck, which I would put with Libra, I think of the Next World Tarot, which is one of my favorite decks for sure. It's a great one. That is my Libra pick, the Next World Tarot. And I'm not putting everything back in boxes just to save time. Hopefully I don't make a big mess. So after Libra comes Scorpio, fixed water sign. And I think of Scorpio as a kind of mysterious, kind of intense, powerful, kind of magic, Scorpio. And this is maybe in some ways the most literal pick that I have made for any of these signs, because of course Scorpio is a fixed water sign, and I chose the Tarot of the North Atlantic, which is a very water-based deck. But I didn't just think, oh, Scorpio's water, and water is the North Atlantic. Not at all. But it's hard to think of something deeper than the ocean, or more mysterious, right? Or more, being able to be in many different dispositions, I think. Like the ocean can be very, very calm at times, but also can certainly be not calm, right? And so there's a lot of power in the ocean, and there's a lot of power in the creatures that are depicted here. And I also think of Scorpio as a sign that is very perceptive. And this deck, I think, speaks to a kind of perceptiveness as well, because there's a lot of really small, intricate detail in this deck, with pins and stitches and buttons and things that you can see here. So when I think of a deck that, requires perhaps, a particular kind of perceptiveness and a kind of penetrating way of approaching things, then this very deep deck of the Tarot of the North Atlantic speaks to that as well. So that is my Scorpio deck, Tarot of the North Atlantic. Again, perhaps a rather obvious literal one, but it's the one that came to mind. Next up is Sagittarius, and Sagittarius is my ascendant. So Sagittarius, I think, is often talked about as a very adventurous, very outgoing, very unrestrained, very free kind of fire sign. Is mutable. But when I think of Sagittarius, particularly as my ascendant, and I've got a couple of things in Sagittarius as well, a couple of other planets in Sagittarius too. Sagittarius is also a very philosophical kind of sign that is interested in ideals and kind of manifesting ideals. Right? And so for that, the deck that I immediately thought of, and I second guessed a lot of these, but I didn't second guess this one. What I thought of for Sagittarius is the philosophy cards. And the philosophy cards are a deck with a very kind of unrestrained kind of art style, which I think speaks to Sagittarius. The philosophy cards are also based on and all about existential philosophy. And existentialism, as a branch of philosophy, is very concerned with freedom and human action and theorizing what freedom looks like. And so I thought that the philosophy cards very perfectly went with Sagittarius for me. So that's my Sagittarius deck, the philosophy cards. Next up is, I'm looking at some notes here to remember the order of everything. The next up is Capricorn. And this is one of the harder ones for me to pick, actually. I don't have planets in Capricorn in my chart, so inevitably I feel like I've learned a little bit more about the signs that are really, really highly represented in my chart. It happens. But Capricorn, of course, is an earth sign. Capricorn is determined, is practical, is pragmatic, I think. I think of Capricorn as being traditional in some ways, but also very disciplined and kind of restrained. And so for that, I actually picked, and this is going to be another one that's maybe a weird pick to people, I picked the Le Tarot Noir. And the reason I picked this one is because, it definitely has a kind of earthy palette to it. In this box that I made out of some paper, because it came in a very large box. It has a kind of earthy palette to it, but also it's certainly, in terms of the decks in my collection, it is almost the most traditional Marseille that I have. It and maybe one other. I don't have a lot of decks that I would describe as traditional in that sense. Very close to the older decks. It's also a deck that its art style to me is very, feels very restrained and very restricted. There's something almost, it's not minimal, right? Like there's lots of details in there, but it feels very controlled. This art style, it doesn't feel, flowy and loose. It feels very, constrained. And I'm not saying that in a positive way or a negative way. I obviously like the artwork very much, but it feels very linear. It feels very, to me, disciplined in a way. So that is why I picked the kind of quirky, I think, Le Tarot Noir for Capricorn, because it does feel quite traditional in the context of my collection anyway. It's a quite traditional deck, and also feels like a very controlled and restrained kind of art as well. Down to the last two signs. Second last is Aquarius. And Aquarius, as a fixed air sign, Aquarius is also, I'm telling you all about my chart in this video. My Venus is in Aquarius, actually. And when I think of Aquarius, I think of certainly also progressive and justice-oriented as well. But I also think of Aquarius as quite intellectual, even like theoretical a little bit. It could be a little bit detached in that sense, but with a lot of, there's a particular kind of creativity, I think, in a kind of creative approach to theoretical kinds of questions, perhaps. That is, is quite an intellectual kind of sign. So trying to think in those terms, I ended up picking the Fifth Spirit Tarot. And this is a deck that certainly feels progressive, feels contemporary, very contemporary in its style, in its representations. But I also think of it as quite an intellectual deck, and maybe some of that is the guidebook and the creator Charlie Claire Burgess's approach to the tarot, and really explaining all of their decisions and how they've envisioned the tarot for this deck. But it feels very Aquarian to me. I love this deck. And there is something airy about it as well. And I'm not sure if it's speaking airy to me because of it has quite a lot, of course, of kind of blank space around a lot of the images. It could be partly that. You know, it's a very kind of crisp and clear art style, certainly. But this one speaks to Aquarius for me. Again, I have no idea if any of these picks are going to make sense to anybody else but me. But when I was looking at my tarot shelf, this is the one that made sense for Aquarius for myself. Finally is Pisces. And if you didn't know, I'm a Pisces sun. My Mercury is also in Pisces. So Pisces is another sign that is well represented in my chart. And for Pisces, I chose the Luminous Void Tarot. And for me, Pisces as a mutable water sign is very intuitive, also very adaptable, but very imaginative. And, you know, I think of the Moon card in the tarot. And so there's something you know, about intuition there, but there's also something that's fantastical about it, right? The moon for me as a card, you know, I don't like when depictions of the moon card are too negative, because I think that the moon card is not just about, you know, confusion or something like that, but it's about that like fantasy of moonlight. And this deck to me has a little bit of the fantastical in it. It's a little bit weird. It's watercolor art, which could speak to Pisces being a water sign. And there's definitely a sense of the fantastical to me in this deck. It's one that is an intuitive reader for me. Some of the representations are quite unique. Some of them are more recognizable. As you know, it's a kind of Smith-Waite inspired deck, but not all. And I really like this deck too. And it's a springtime deck for me, so it was out on my shelf when I was making this VR. And I thought, well, this feels Pisces, you know, intuitive and adaptable and a little bit fantastical. So, Luminous Void Tarot, that's my Pisces deck. And that is all for me for the one deck for each sign. Thank you, merci beaucoup, Steph, for starting this tag, and for other folks who've done VRs. I've very much enjoyed watching them, and I'm glad to join with my VR very late. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all soon again. Bye.